I was trying to make it through yet another boring day at my job when I was approached by one of my coworkers. They told me they had a chainsaw that hadn't been used in a while and wanted me to go through it and get it ready for storm season. And of course I told them that I'd be glad to do it, but I did want to know which brand it was just so that I wasn't surprised by it, and when they told me it was an older Echo, I then wanted to work on it even more. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Echo chainsaw, and the problem is that it starts and runs, but it dies when you try to use it. Now, for the most part, those that have these never seem to use them unless it's for an emergency or need to use them for odd jobs around the house. And unfortunately, with this type of use, it means it spends more time in its storage case than being used, which if you didn't know is not good for it, especially if it wasn't prepped to be stored. Now, I'm going to try and repair this chainsaw, but yours might be a bit different, so this might not work on yours. So if things aren't working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. So the first thing that I want to do is take a look around the chainsaw and see what kind of condition it's in, and for the most part, it's in excellent shape. And besides from being just a bit dirty from the last time it was used, I'd say this chainsaw wasn't used all that much either. Now the other way that you can tell that it's not worn out is because when you pull on the rope, you can tell that the engine is still in great shape. And that's because you can feel the engine fighting back quite a bit on each compression stroke. If it was worn out, it wouldn't be fighting back this much. Before we get too far into this project, I would like to give it a quick spray and rinse, and that's because aside from a well-used edger or neglected mower, chainsaws can get really gross in quite a short time. The best part about cleaning one of these is that it takes very little time to, even when compared to a string trimmer, which can take a surprising amount of time to get clean. Of course, you don't have to have it cleaned before fixing it, but I find that it helps to keep my hands clean when dealing with the carb, and I want to make sure I don't get dirt in places where it shouldn't be. And of course, when handling a chainsaw, you not only have to worry about dirt, but also sawdust and bar oil. So you can see why this could possibly be something you want to be cleaned before putting your hands on it. Now you don't have to clean it to a point that you can eat off of it, but I'm just getting to a place that when I handle it, I don't have to worry too much about what gets on my hands. Now I'm going to let you know that most manuals will tell you not to clean the machine with any sort of water, but if it's your machine, then do what you want with it.
Hey, but the stuff you're fixing isn't yours, so knowing that, why are you still using water to clean it then?
Now that answer is pretty simple. Since they wanted me to fix it, cleaning it with water is how I clean it. Otherwise, take it somewhere else and have them leave it dirty while they fix it. And besides that, if I'm cleaning it and something does go wrong with water getting somewhere it shouldn't, I'm going to take care of it anyway because it is my responsibility. And also, cleaning something like this can take a couple of minutes or as long as you want it to. So it is up to you if you want to go overboard with the cleaning or just run a rag over it. Now after you get done rinsing it, I would always recommend using a blower or compressed air to help get all that water off the machine. Otherwise, let it dry naturally in the sun, but I would recommend that you change the way it's sitting once in a while to help get all that water out of it. Now that didn't take too long, did it? And as you can see, it's now much better looking and I feel more comfortable working on it and not worrying about getting my hands dirty. So the first thing that I want to do is to try and start the machine, but I'm not completely sure if it has any fuel in it. Also, come to find out, it would appear that they like to use a flathead screwdriver to tighten the fuel cap because this was on there a lot tighter than it really needs to be. Now the fuel tank is practically full, which means more than likely they just put some in there, and unless they're not good at mixing fuel, we should be good to go for a test start. Well, the good news is that it's doing exactly what my coworker was saying it was doing. Of course, the bad news is that we now have to fix it, which is the tough part, because we have a couple of options, and to be honest, I hate having to make this choice, but why? Well, the most likely reason for it to act this way would be an issue with the carb, which is no surprise there. But it's how we go about fixing it is where we have to make our choice, and this will then determine how much time we have to spend on the project. After taking off the engine cover, we can see that the area around the carb is absolutely covered in sawdust, which means we'll have to clean this before we go on. There will be no water used in this area. Instead, I'll be using compressed air, safety glasses, and my face shield for this one. And if you think I'm going a bit too far with the PPE, then you've never had oily sawdust in your eye before, and take it from me, it's very uncomfortable. So the first and in my mind the easiest way to try and fix this would be to make some adjustments to the high and low fuel screws, which you can see right here. And unfortunately they have these plastic limiter caps on them to keep them from being turned too much, but it is a place to start though. The problem though is that most would say that I'm simply covering up what the real issue is, which is a failing carb, and to be honest, they would be correct. Now the second way to fix it would be to take the carb off the machine and service it and then put it back in, and hopefully it'll work without needing any adjustments. Now the third option is a lot like the second one, but instead of just taking the carb out and servicing it, we'd end up replacing it completely. It's not as fun, but it gets the job done with little to no headaches. Also, now would be a great time to dump that fuel out of the tank and get an idea of its condition. And the reason why is because fuel that's too old or contaminated might also be causing our issues. However, I really do doubt it. In fact, the fuel looks and smells just like it should, and I don't see anything in there that shouldn't be in there, like water. Also, I do intend on putting this fuel back into the machine once we get done with it, and the reason why is because this fuel represents the fuel they're using, and putting my own in there wouldn't. Now, getting this carb off the machine wasn't as tough as I thought it was going to be. However, it's not all that obvious either, like it would be on most other machines. Now, the only real difference is having to take this back plate off the engine that holds and braces the on-off switch, the choke, and throttle linkage. And once these are out of the way, it's a whole lot easier to get to the bolts for the carb now. After the bolts have been taken out, we can then take the base off for the air filter. We can then disconnect the upper hose, which is the impulse line, followed by the fuel line from the tank. I know that having a purge bulb makes it a lot easier to get a small engine started, but it makes the fuel line routing much more difficult. I much prefer it this way, at least from a fixing point of view, but most consumers would rather have the machine be easier to start. Now the carb itself is not all that interesting or special, but we do need to take this plate off for the limiters. That way we can make our adjustments, and once we have them where we want them, we can put the limiter caps back on the screws. Now the plate has been pinched into place, and I thought I could grind off enough metal to relieve the pressure on it, but they did a really good job on this one. That, and I really didn't want to damage the plastic caps any more than I had to, so this didn't work like I wanted it to. And unfortunately, that means I'm going to have to use more effort than I really wanted to, and you'll see what I mean by that here in just a bit. But before I do that, I want to try and save this gasket that's stuck on the carb by taking it off so it doesn't get damaged while I'm handling it. Next, I'm going to use a small drill bit to carefully make a pilot hole in the corner of the metal plate. After that, I'm going to insert a screw into the hole. Once I've got the screw started, I'll then see if I can pull the plate free from the carb by grabbing onto the screw. However, this method only pulled out one end of the plate, which means I'll need to do the same process to the other side of the plate, only this time it worked out much better. Once the metal plate is out of the way, I can then remove the other plastic cap, but before we take out the screws, I'll need to use some compressed air to blow out all the metal debris in there. Otherwise, when I take the screws out, that debris could get into the carb and really do some damage to it. Now once that's done, we can now take the carb apart and see if there's anything wrong inside of it. And the first thing that I want to look at is the pumping diaphragm, which is under this metal plate where the impulse line goes. And what you're looking for is that the check valve flaps are not bent and are instead laying flat with the rest of the diaphragm. Now luckily our flaps are not bent, which means we can reuse this diaphragm, but if they were severely bent and out of shape, I would consider replacing it. The next item I want to check is that the round inlet screen is not clogged with any sort of debris, which luckily this one is not. But if your inlet screen is clogged with debris, you'll need to clean it and also check that the fuel filter hasn't come off the fuel line in the tank. After that, I then want to take off the metal plate that's covering the metering diaphragm so we can inspect it for any issues. Now with the plate finally out of the way, we can see the diaphragm, and there's good news and bad news. First off, the good news, which is that the diaphragm is still very flexible, which it needs to be, but the bad news pretty much offsets any of the good news. Now the diaphragm is supposed to be flat and parallel with where the plate goes, which I'm helping to visualize with my screwdriver. However, the diaphragm is not that way. Instead, it's slightly crooked, which I'm showing you with my screwdriver. And on top of all that, there's also a few wrinkles on the edges, so combine that with being crooked and they could affect how it moves, which is not good for the carb. So what's my verdict on this diaphragm then? Well, I'd give it a fair to poor rating, meaning it's usable, but it has some issues and it would be best if we just replaced it with a new one. The next thing that we need to do is take the carb apart so that we can put it into our ultrasonic cleaner. This will also include taking out the fuel adjustment screws. However, we'll need to find out where the screws were sitting at before we take them out. So here's a trick I like to use. Find the H and L letters on the carb, and then what I like to do is have the L facing my left side. Now doing it this way will help keep the screws from being swapped around because that could cause some issues later on and I want to avoid them as much as possible. Then I'm going to turn the screw clockwise until it stops, all the while counting how many turns it takes for it to do that. Then when I put the screws back into the carb, I can then put them back to where I found them. Now that's assuming that the factory was the one that set them in the first place. Now this is important. The settings you're seeing were made for this specific engine, for this machine, which means these settings may not work for your engine. Now of course you can try these settings if you want to, but there are no guarantees that it's going to work for you either. I'm also going to let you know that I do not know what the default settings are supposed to be for this carb, so please don't ask. Now once the carb is finally apart, I'll then drop the parts I want to get cleaned into a glass jar and put that jar into the cleaner for about 20 minutes. Now 20 minutes may not be enough, and depending upon how they look after the first round, I might do one more round after that. So here are the clean parts and they look really good. However, I still had to use some compressed air on it to make sure that there wasn't any of the cleaner left in the passages. After that, we then had the tedious job of putting back all those tiny parts, including putting the fuel screws back in the same way as we found them. And of course, we can't forget to replace the metering diaphragm, which if you buy a single one should be between $5 and $8 depending upon where you get it from. Of course, there is a better option to cleaning and servicing a carb, and that is to just replace it, and I'm going to tell you why that is. So first off is value. Because of the aftermarket, you can get a new carb for around $10 to $20 depending upon what all you get with that carb. The second reason why is you won't have to do what I'm doing right now, which is very time consuming, especially if you're not used to doing it. And the third and best reason is if you like something to be easy and don't want to make something difficult even more challenging, then just replace the carb. Of course, if you're low on funds but have loads of time to spare, then yes, servicing and cleaning that old carb makes total sense then. However, if your time is very valuable to you, either because you make a lot of money or you simply don't have the time to spare, then just buy a new carb instead. Now that the carb is finally back on the machine, we'll then just replace the air filter followed by the top cover. Then I'll put the fuel that we took out of it back into it, and lastly check that we have some bar oil in it, then we'll try and start it and test it out. Now since we do not have a purge bulb, I do not want to risk flooding the engine. So to get fuel from the tank to the carb, I'm going to pull on the rope with no choke, then we'll do the normal startup procedure after that. Well, it seems to be doing much better than before, and aside from needing to have the chain sharpened, I think with 1 or 2 more cold starts and test cuts, it should be ready to go back to my coworker. Now I do apologize, my normal log that I've been cutting on has since walked off, so until then, this fallen branch is the only thing I've got to cut until we get to the larger parts of it. Now, I don't get to see the gray versions of these Echo chainsaws very often, but to be honest, they seem to be as good as the newer orange versions. But then again, that's just my opinion about them, and I'm pretty sure some of you out there might have a different opinion about them, which is perfectly fine with me. So my question is, if you saw one of the gray versions of an Echo chainsaw for half the price of the orange version, would you consider getting it? Or would you rather spend more money on a used steel chainsaw instead? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.